Greetings, traveller. The morning mist clung to the ancient oaks of Elderbloom Forest like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their hold on the towering trunks. Deep within the woodland's heart, where paths twisted like forgotten memories and streams sang secrets to the stones, a gentle giant stirred from his slumber. Brum Hollowbelly opened his eyes slowly as he did most things and gazed up at the canopy above his cave. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting dancing patterns on the moss-covered walls of his humble home. The troll stretched his massive arms, each movement deliberate and careful, mindful of the delicate bird's nest that had been built in the corner of his dwelling. The family of wrens within had grown accustomed to their unusual neighbour, and Brum had grown fond of their cheerful morning songs. Today, however, their melody carried an extra note of excitement, as if they too knew that this day was different from all others. Today was the day of the Greenwood run. Brum sat up slowly, his enormous frame casting shadows across the cave floor. At nearly 12 feet tall and broader than most doorways, he was an imposing figure to those who didn't know his gentle nature. His skin was the color of weathered stone, grey-green like the bark of the oldest trees, and his hair fell in thick moss-colored braids past his shoulders. His eyes, large and kind, reflected the warm brown of rich earth after rain. For months, Brum had thought about this day. The Greenwood run came only once every 10 years, and he had watched the previous races from afar, hidden among the trees where no one could see him or whisper cruel words about his appearance. He had seen the swift elves dance across the forest floor like autumn leaves on the wind, had watched the determined dwarves push through obstacles with unwavering resolve, had observed the fierce werewolves bound through the underbrush with supernatural grace. And each time he had wondered what it might feel like to run alongside them, to be part of something greater than his solitary existence in the depths of Elderbloom Forest. The decision to enter had not come easily. Brum was well aware of his limitations. His footsteps shook the ground when he walked, startling rabbits and causing birds to take flight. His size made him clumsy, and his weight made him slow. Throughout his long life, he had endured the mockery of those who encountered him on the rare occasions when he ventured beyond his forest home. Lumbering fool, they would call him, or mountain of uselessness. The words had carved themselves deep into his heart, settling there like stones in a still pond. But something had changed 3 seasons ago, when he had discovered a young deer trapped beneath a fallen branch. The creature had been frightened and injured, its leg pinned beneath the weight of storm-felled oak. Without hesitation, Brum had lifted the massive branch as if it weighed no more than a feather, freeing the grateful animal. As the deer had bounded away into the forest, pausing once to look back at him with what seemed like gratitude, Brum had felt something stir within his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Perhaps, he had thought, there was more to strength than speed. Perhaps there was more to worth than what others saw when they looked at him. The morning air was crisp as Brum emerged from his cave, carrying with him a simple pack containing dried berries and clear spring water. He had trained for this day in his own quiet way, walking the forest paths at dawn when no one else was about, learning to move more quietly despite his size. teaching himself to read the subtle signs of the woodland that might guide him along the racecourse. The starting area for the Greenwood run lay in the heart of an ancient clearing known as the Circle of Stones. Massive granite monoliths, older than memory, formed a perfect ring around a meadow carpeted with soft grass and wildflowers. Legend spoke of the stones being placed by the first druids who had made Elderbloom their home, though none now living could say if this was truth or tale. As Broom approached the clearing, he could hear the sounds of gathering, voices raised in excitement, the whinny of horses, the creak of leather, and the rustle of equipment being checked and rechecked. His steps grew slower, and he found himself pausing at the edge of the tree line, suddenly uncertain. Before him spread a scene that might have been painted by a master artist. Dozens of competitors had assembled, each representing the finest of their kind. Near the largest of the standing stones, a group of elves moved with fluid grace, their silver hair catching the morning light like spun moonbeams. They wore garments that seemed woven from spider silk and shadow, perfectly fitted to their lithe forms. Even their laughter sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Among them stood one who was clearly their leader, Kyle Silverleaf, whose reputation had spread far beyond the borders of Elderbloom. His eyes were the pale green of new leaves, and he moved with the confidence of one who had never known defeat. Broom watched as Kyle stretched his legs with casual elegance, each movement a study in perfect form. Not far from the elves, a cluster of dwarves had gathered around their own champion. Rock Ironbeard was built like the mountains of his homeland, solid, unyielding, and enduring. His red beard was braided with small silver bells that chimed softly as he moved, and his legs, though short, were thick with muscle earned through countless miles in underground tunnels and mountain paths. The other dwarves spoke to him in low, encouraging voices, their hands slapping his shoulders in gestures of brotherhood and support. Near the edge of the circle, standing somewhat apart from the others, was a figure that made even Brum's nerves quicken. Vera Moonhowl stood with the perfect stillness of a predator, her wild hair silver white, and her eyes a startling amber that seemed to glow with inner fire. She wore simple leather garments that would not restrict her movement, and even in her human form there was something undeniably lupine about the way she held herself. When she moved, it was with the controlled power of barely leashed wildness. These and many others filled the clearing, humans with faces set in determined concentration, halflings whose eager chatter masked serious preparation, and even a few representatives of the rarer folk who dwelt in the deepest parts of the magical realm. Each seemed perfectly suited to the challenge ahead, lean and swift and confident. And then there was Brom. He became aware that conversations had begun to falter as he stepped into the clearing. Heads turned, eyes widened, and more. Then a few mouths fell open. A troll entering the Greenwood run was unprecedented, and he could read the surprise and skepticism in every face that turned his way. "Well, would you look at that?" he heard one human mutter to another. "What does he think this is, a stone-carrying contest?" "Poor creature," whispered an elf, though whether with pity or disdain, Brum could not tell. Someone should have explained to him what this race entails. The comments stung, as they always did, but Broom forced himself to continue walking toward the registration area. He had come this far, and he would not turn back now, regardless of what others thought. At the center of the circle, upon a raised dais of carved stone, stood the race organizer himself, Archmage Eldrin Thalos. The wizard was ancient beyond reckoning, his long white beard flowing like a waterfall down his midnight blue robes. His staff, carved from the heartwood of 1,000-year-old oak, hummed with quiet power. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the entire clearing without seeming raised, as if the very air itself bent to carry his words. "Welcome, champions of the realm, to the great circle," Eldrin intoned, his pale eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. "You have come from far lands and near, drawn by the call of the Greenwood run. Some of you seek glory, others test their limits, and still others run for reasons known only to your own hearts. All are welcome here, for the forest judges not by appearance, but by the content of one's spirit." As if the wizard's eyes had lingered on him for just a moment longer than the others, Broom felt a flicker of hope warm his chest. He approached the registration table, where a harried-looking gnome with ink-stained fingers looked up at him with barely concealed surprise. "Name?" the gnome squeaked, his quill poised over a lengthy scroll. "Broom Hollowbelly," the troll replied, his voice a gentle rumble like distant thunder. The gnome blinked several times, as if waiting for Broom to admit he was joking. When no such admission came, he carefully wrote the name on his list. "And you're quite certain you wish to enter the race?" "Yes," Broom said simply. "Right then." The gnome handed him a small wooden token carved with intricate runes. "Wear this at all times during the race. It will glow if you stray too far from the approved course, and it will dim when you cross the finish line. The race begins at the sound of the horn. May the forest guide your steps." Broom accepted the token with a polite nod and found a quiet spot near the edge of the circle to wait. Around him, the other competitors continued their preparations, some stretching and limbering up, others checking their equipment one final time, still others standing in quiet meditation or prayer. He tried not to notice the glances and whispered conversations that seemed to follow him wherever he looked. Instead, he focused on the forest itself, letting the familiar sounds and scents calm his nervous heart. Somewhere high above, birds called to one another in the ancient language of wing and wind. The earth beneath his feet thrummed with the slow, steady pulse of deep roots and flowing water. This was his home, his sanctuary, and today it would be his racecourse. As the morning progressed, latecomers continued to arrive, each adding their own energy to the growing excitement in the clearing. But it was the arrival of the final competitor that sent a ripple of unease through the assembled crowd. Grashnak Bloodtread entered the circle of stones like a storm cloud, blotting out the sun. The orc stood nearly as tall as Broom, but where the troll was broad and solid, Grashnak was all sharp angles and corded muscle. His skin was the color of old leather, marked with ritual scars that spoke of countless battles. His eyes, small and cruel, swept across the other competitors with obvious disdain. Most unsettling of all were his teeth, filed too, points that gleamed like ivory knives when he smiled. Behind Grashnak came a small retinue of other orcs, clearly his supporters, though they were not entered in the race themselves. They wore dark cloaks and spoke in harsh whispers among themselves, their eyes never still, always watching, always calculating. Brum had heard stories of Grashnak Bloodtread. The orc was said to be ruthlessly competitive, willing to do whatever it took to win. He had been victorious in numerous contests across the realm, though there were always whispers afterward, claims of unsporting behavior, accusations of cheating that could never quite be proven. Still, his victories were undeniable, and his speed was legendary. As Grashnak registered for the race, his gaze fell upon Brum. For a moment, their eyes met across the clearing, and Brum saw something flicker in the orc's expression. Not concern exactly, but a calculating assessment that made the troll's skin crawl. Then Grashnak's lips pulled back in that knife-toothed smile, and he looked away as if Brum was beneath his notice. The sun had climbed higher now, burning away the morning mist and filling the clearing with warm golden light. Archmage Eldrin Thalos raised his staff, and a crystalline chime rang out across the circle, calling all competitors to attention. "The time has come," the wizard announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "You stand now at the threshold of the Greenwood Run, a test that has challenged the finest athletes of our realm for centuries untold. The course before you will lead through the deepest heart of Elder Bloom Forest, along paths known only to the trees themselves." Eldrin gestured with his staff, and images began to form in the air above his head, misty, translucent scenes that showed glimpses of the course ahead. Dense groves, where ancient oaks grew so closely together their branches formed a living tunnel. Streams that sparkled like liquid silver as they wound between moss-covered stones, clearings filled with flowers that glowed with their own inner light, and deep within the forest's heart, the crumbling ruins of some long-forgotten civilization, overgrown with vines and mystery. "The course is marked, but not always clearly," Eldrin continued. "Trust in your instincts, listen to the wisdom of the wood, and remember that the swiftest path is not always the straightest. There are 3 checkpoints along the way: the Singing Falls, the Grove of Whispers, and the Ancient Bridge. All who would claim victory must pass through each in order." The wizard's pale eyes grew stern. "Let all here understand. This is a test of more than mere speed. The forest sees all, judges all, and remembers all. Run with honor, or do not run at all." Brum felt a shiver run down his spine at those words, though he could not have said why. Around the circle, the competitors had arranged themselves along an invisible starting line, each finding their preferred position for the beginning of the race. The elves clustered together, their movements synchronized like a school of fish. The dwarves stood solid and ready, their hands on their knees as they prepared to drive forward with explosive power. Vera Moonhowl crouched low, every muscle coiled like a spring, and Grashnak Bloodtread stood at the very center of the line, his dark eyes fixed on the forest path ahead with an intensity that seemed almost hungry. Brum found himself a spot near the back of the group, not from strategy, but from habit. He had spent so much of his life trying not to get in anyone's way that it felt natural to let others go first. Besides, he reasoned, he would need every advantage he could get, even if it meant starting a few steps behind. Eldrin Thalos raised a great horn to his lips, an ancient thing carved from the tusk of some primordial beast and inlaid with silver runes that seemed to pulse with their own light. The clearing fell silent but for the whisper of wind in the leaves and the distant song of running water. "Runners of the Greenwood," the wizard called, "may your feet be swift, your hearts be true, and your spirits find what they seek in the depths of elder bloom. Let the great race begin." The horn's call rang out across the forest, deep and resonant and wild, like the voice of the woodland itself given sound, and with that clarion note, the Greenwood run began. The faster competitors exploded from the starting line like arrows from a bow. Cale Silverleaf seemed to float above the ground as he glided forward, his silver hair streaming behind him like a banner. The dwarves charged ahead with the inexorable power of an avalanche, led by Rock Ironbeard's determined stride. Vera Moonhowl bounded forward in great leaps that carried her over obstacles other runners had to navigate around, and Grashnak Bloodtread, despite his size, moved with surprising grace and terrible speed, his long legs eating up the distance as he quickly established himself among the leaders. Broom began to run. It was not by any measure an impressive start. Where others had sprinted away like released springs, the troll's first steps were careful and measured. But as he found his rhythm, something remarkable happened. The earth seemed to welcome his footfalls rather than protest them. His breathing, deep and steady, fell into harmony with the rustling of leaves overhead, and slowly, gradually, Broom began to smile. For the first time in his very long life, he was part of something magnificent. Behind him, the circle of stones grew smaller with each step. Ahead lay the great mystery of Elder Bloom Forest and whatever trials awaited. Around him, glimpsed occasionally through the trees, his fellow runners pursued their own dreams of victory and vindication. Broom Hollowbelly was in last place, just as he had expected to be. But as the forest embraced him with its cool shadows and ancient wisdom, he discovered something that surprised him. He didn't care about his position at all. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he was exactly where he belonged. The path wound deeper into the woodland, and Brown followed it with growing wonder, his great heart full of hope, and his steps carrying him toward whatever destiny awaited in the green depths ahead. The forest path wound deeper into Elder Bloom's heart, and with each step, Broom felt himself settling into a rhythm that was entirely his own. While the other competitors had vanished ahead like scattered leaves on a swift stream, he maintained his steady, deliberate pace. The wooden token at his chest glowed with a soft blue light, confirming that he remained on the proper course, though the way ahead was far from clear. Ancient trees rose around him like living pillars, their trunks so vast that even Broom's considerable reach could not have encompassed them. Shafts of sunlight filtered down through the canopy in golden columns, illuminating patches of forest floor carpeted with moss so thick it cushioned his footfalls. The air itself seemed alive, heavy with the scent of growing things and the whispered secrets of countless seasons. As he walked, Broom began to notice details that his rushing competitors had likely missed in their haste. A family of squirrels watched him from a low branch, chittering softly among themselves as if discussing this unusual visitor. When one of the smaller creatures lost its grip and tumbled toward the ground, Broom was there to catch it gently in his enormous palm, setting it carefully back on the branch before continuing on his way. The path split ahead, offering two choices: a wide, well-worn trail that curved away to the right, or a narrower way that led straight ahead through a grove of silver birches. Broom paused, considering. The broader path showed clear signs of recent passage: broken twigs, disturbed leaves, the faint impressions of many feet. Surely that was the way the other runners had gone. But something about the smaller path called to him. Perhaps it was the way the light fell between the birch trees, creating a natural corridor that seemed to beckon. Or perhaps it was the sound he heard coming from that direction, a soft musical tinkling like distant chimes. Following his instincts, as Eldrin Thalos had advised, Broom chose the narrower way. The birch grove was a place of ethereal beauty. The tree's white bark seemed to glow with its own inner light, and their leaves whispered secrets to one another in voices too soft for most ears to hear. But Broom, moving slowly and quietly despite his size, caught fragments of their ancient language. They spoke of hidden ways and safe passages, of shortcuts known only to those who took time to listen. The musical sound grew stronger as he progressed, and soon Broom discovered its source. A small stream wound between the birches, its water so clear it seemed like liquid crystal. But this was no ordinary brook. As the water flowed over smooth stones, each impact created a note, pure and sweet. The stream was literally singing, and its melody guided Broom along a path he never could have found on his own. Following the singing water, he emerged from the birch grove to find himself at the edge of a spectacular sight. Before him stretched a series of cascading waterfalls, each pool flowing into the next in a chain that descended through the forest like a natural staircase. The water caught the afternoon light and threw it back in millions of sparkling diamonds, while the sound of falling water created a symphony that resonated through the surrounding trees. This, Broom realized, must be the Singing Falls, the first checkpoint Eldrin Thalos had mentioned. But as he approached, he discovered he was not alone. Huddled on a moss-covered boulder near the largest of the falls sat a figure that might have been carved from shadow and starlight. It was Vera Moonhowl. But something was terribly wrong. Lydia's werewolf's usual predatory grace was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she sat hunched over, her hands pressed to her temples, her breathing labored and uneven. Broom approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Are you injured?" he asked, his deep voice gentle with concern. Vera's amber eyes snapped up to meet his, and he saw confusion and anger warring in their depths. "Something's not right," she growled, her words slightly slurred. "I was running, keeping pace with the leaders, when suddenly smoke, thick, acrid smoke that came from nowhere. It burned my nose, my throat, made my eyes water so badly I couldn't see the path." She gestured helplessly at the crystal-clear air around them. "But there's no smoke here now, no sign of any fire. It's as if it was never there at all." Her keen senses, Broom knew, were far superior to those of most other beings. If Vera claimed to have encountered smoke, then smoke there had been, regardless of what evidence remained. "Perhaps you should rest a while longer," Broom suggested. Let your body recover fully before continuing." Vera's laugh was bitter. "Rest, while my competitors gain more distance with every moment. I should be at the front of the pack, not sitting here feeling sorry for myself." She started to rise, then swayed dangerously. Brum's massive hand steadied her before she could fall. "The race will still be here when you're ready," he said simply. "There's no shame in taking care of yourself." Something in his tone seemed to reach her. Vera studied his face for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You're the troll from the starting line. Brum, wasn't it? What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be—" She paused, perhaps remembering that assumptions about speed based on appearance weren't always accurate. "I'm exactly where I should be," Brum replied with a gentle smile. "And so are you for now." While Vera recovered, Brum took the opportunity to examine the area around the Singing Falls more carefully. The checkpoint itself was marked by an ancient stone pillar covered in luminous moss that pulsed softly when runners approached. But it was what he found near the base of the pillar that troubled him. Half hidden beneath a pile of fallen leaves was a small clay sphere, cracked and empty. Brum lifted it carefully, noting the acrid smell that still clung to its interior. This, he suspected, had contained whatever substance had created the mysterious smoke that had overcome Vera. But who would have placed such a thing here, and why? He said nothing of his discovery to Vera, not wanting to distress her further. Instead, he helped her to the checkpoint stone, where the magical pulse seemed to restore some of her strength and clarity. When she was ready to continue, they parted ways, she bounding ahead with renewed vigor, he maintaining his steady, thoughtful pace. But Brum carried the broken sphere with him, tucked safely in his pack. Something was not right about this race, and his gentle nature was troubled by the implications. The path beyond the Singing Falls led through a section of forest unlike any Brum had seen before. Here the trees grew in perfect spirals, their trunks twisted like frozen dancers reaching toward the sky. Flowers bloomed that had no names in common tongues, their petals shifting through colors that existed only in dreams. This was old magic, the kind that had slept in Elder Bloom's depths since the world was young. As he walked through this wonderland, Brum encountered other signs that all was not well with the race. He found tracks that led away from the main path toward dense thickets, tracks that belonged to runners who should have been far ahead of him by now. In one clearing, he discovered the remnants of what had once been a trail marker, its wooden posts snapped in half and its directional signs scattered and broken. Most disturbing of all, he began to hear sounds in the distance that had nothing to do with the natural rhythms of the forest. Harsh voices calling out in the Orshish tongue, the crash of heavy footsteps moving through undergrowth, and once the sound of something large falling, followed by a cry of frustration that echoed through the trees. Brum's suspicions crystallized into certainty as he approached the second checkpoint. The Grove of Whispers was said to be a place where the trees themselves held counsel, their ancient voices sharing the wisdom of ages with any who knew how to listen. But as he drew near, he heard different voices entirely, rough, guttural speech that spoke of ambush and sabotage. Moving with surprising stealth for one of his size, Broom crept to the edge of the grove and peered through the undergrowth. What he saw made his gentle heart burn with anger. 3 orcs in dark cloaks, members of Grashnak's retinue, were busy at work around a massive oak tree that had fallen directly across the main path. But this was no natural windfall. The tree's trunk showed the clear marks of axe blades, and the orcs were now working to disguise their handiwork, scattering leaves and debris to make the obstruction appear accidental. "Hurry!" one of them growled to the others. "Grashnak will be through here soon, and this needs to look like it's been down for days." "What about the troll?" another asked, glancing nervously in Broom's direction. "Grashnak said he might be trouble." The first orc laughed harshly. "That lumbering fool! He'll never make it this far, and even if he does, what's he going to do? Bore us to death with his politeness?" Broom's massive hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to remain still. Violence would solve nothing here, and besides, he was outnumbered. Instead, he began to work his way carefully around the grove, looking for another way through. The orcs had chosen their sabotage well. The fallen oak was enormous, its trunk too high to climb over, and its root system too tangled to crawl under. Any runner following the main path would be forced to find a way around, adding precious time to their race. But Broom's intimate knowledge of Elder Bloom served him well. He remembered a deer path that skirted the grove's eastern edge, narrow and overgrown, but passable for one who didn't mind a few scratches from thorny branches. As he made his way along this hidden route, Broom came upon a sight that broke his heart. Tharn, the disciplined human warrior, sat slumped against a tree trunk, his head in his hands. His usually immaculate gear was muddy and torn, and his face bore the expression of one utterly defeated. "The signs," Tharn muttered as Broom approached. "The trail signs have all been turned around. I've been running in circles for hours, ending up in the same clearings again and again. How could I have been so foolish?" Broom studied the warrior's face and saw no deception there, only genuine confusion and frustration. "You're not foolish," he said gently. "Someone has tampered with the markers. Come, I know another way to the checkpoint." Together, they made their way through Broom's secret path, emerging near the Grove of Whispers, just as the orcs were completing their deception. The checkpoint stone stood in the grove's heart, surrounded by the ancient oaks whose whispered conversations had given the place its name. As they approached the pillar, its moss pulsed with welcoming light. Tharn's gratitude was profound. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why would someone sabotage the race markers? What could they hope to gain?" Broom thought of Grashnak Bloodtread's cold, calculating eyes and knife-toothed smile. "Some people believe winning is worth any price," he said sadly. They parted ways at the checkpoint, Tharn jogging ahead with renewed determination, while Broom maintained his steady pace. But the troll's mind was troubled as he continued deeper into the forest. How many other runners had fallen victim to such deceptions? And what other traps might lie ahead? The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the trees when Broom encountered the most distressing sight yet. In a clearing beside a babbling brook, he found Rock Ironbeard sitting motionless on a fallen log. The dwarf's usual fiery determination had been replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. "Rock," Broom called softly, "are you all right?" The dwarf looked up with eyes that seemed to struggle to focus. I can't remember," he said slowly. "I was running, making good time, when I smelled something sweet, like honey and flowers. I followed the scent, thinking it might lead to water, and then—" He gestured helplessly. "Everything became confused. I remember wandering through the trees, but I couldn't tell which way was forward and which was back. Time seemed to stretch and bend, and now I'm here. But I don't know how I got here or how long I've been sitting." Brum's heart ached for the proud dwarf's confusion. He searched the clearing carefully and found what he was looking for. Another clay sphere, this one shattered against a tree trunk. Unlike the one that had contained the smoke that overcame Vara, this sphere bore traces of a different substance. A sweet, cloying residue that made Broom's head swim when he breathed it in too deeply. Some kind of disorienting drug, he realized, designed to cloud the mind and scramble the senses. He helped Rock to the brook, encouraging him to drink deeply of the clear, cold water. Gradually, the dwarf's natural resilience began to reassert itself. "Foul play," Rock growled when he had recovered enough to understand what had happened. No honorable competitor would stoop to such tactics. "Can you continue?" Brum asked with concern. Rock's eyes blazed with righteous anger. "Aye, and gladly. Whoever did this will find that it takes more than fairy dust and pretty smells to stop a son of the Iron Hills." As they walked together toward the third and final checkpoint, Rock shared troubling news. He had glimpsed other competitors during his confused wandering. Carl Silverleaf arguing with someone unseen in the shadows, several of the human runners sitting dazed by the side of trails that led nowhere, even one of the swift halflings nursing what appeared to be a badly sprained ankle. It's as if someone is systematically eliminating the competition, Rock mused. But who would dare such a thing in the sacred Greenwood run? Brum thought he knew the answer, but he kept his suspicions to himself. Speaking accusations without proof would help no one. Instead, he focused on helping his new friend navigate the increasingly treacherous course ahead. The ancient bridge, their final checkpoint before the race's end, spanned a deep gorge carved by countless centuries of flowing water. The bridge itself was a marvel, constructed from living wood that had been shaped and guided by druidic magic, rather than cut and assembled by conventional means. Its railings were formed from intertwined branches that still bore leaves, and its deck was a lattice work of roots so tightly woven they formed a surface as solid as any stone. But as Brum and Rock approached the bridge, they discovered that this checkpoint too had been tampered with. The magical vines that should have guided runners safely across had been partially severed, creating gaps in the natural railings. Several of the root planks in the deck had been loosened, creating treacherous footing that could send an unwary runner plunging into the gorge below. "By my beard," Rock breathed, "this is beyond unsporting. This is attempted murder." Broom examined the damage carefully. The cuts were fresh, made with sharp blades wielded by skilled hands. But the sabotage was subtle, designed to look like natural deterioration to anyone who didn't look closely. Most runners focused on speed and maintaining their position in the race would never notice the danger until it was too late. Working together, the unlikely partners spent precious time repairing what damage they could. Broom's great strength allowed him to lift and secure the loosened planks, while Rock's dwarven craftsmanship skills helped weave the severed vines back together. It wasn't perfect, but it would be safer for any runners who came after them. As they worked, they were joined by other competitors who had managed to overcome the various obstacles and deceptions scattered throughout the course. Vera Moonhowl arrived first, having recovered from her earlier ordeal, but clearly still shaken by the experience. Tharn appeared next, his warrior's discipline having seen him through the maze of misdirection he had encountered. Several others trickled in, humans, halflings, and even one of the elves, though notably absent was Kale Silverleaf. Each runner shared similar stories of mysterious obstacles, confusing diversions, and near disasters that had cost them precious time. The pattern was clear to all. Of them now, someone was cheating, and doing so on a massive scale. "We should report this to Eldrin Thalos," Tharn suggested. "This corruption cannot be allowed to stand." But Vera shook her head grimly. "The race must be completed first. Those are the ancient rules. No accusations can be made until all runners have crossed the finish line." She looked around at the small group of survivors. "Besides, we have no proof of who is responsible." "Oh, I think we all know who's responsible," Rock muttered darkly. "The question is what we're going to do about it." Brum, who had been listening quietly while continuing to secure the bridge repairs, finally spoke. "We're going to finish the race," he said simply. "All of us, together if need be. We're going to cross that finish line with our heads held high, and we're going to show whoever did this that their schemes have failed." There was something in the gentle troll's voice, a quiet strength that hadn't been there at the beginning of the race, that rallied the spirits of his fellow competitors. One by one, they nodded their agreement. As the sun sank lower toward the western horizon, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson, the small group of survivors set out on the final stretch of the Greenwood run. They had been tested by more than just the natural challenges of Elderbloom Forest. They had faced deliberate sabotage, overcome artificial obstacles, and helped one another when honor demanded it. Ahead of them lay the finish line, and whatever revelations awaited there. Behind them, the forest whispered its approval of their choices, for the trees themselves had witnessed every act of courage and kindness along the way. Brum Hollowbelly ran on, no longer thinking about being last or proving himself to others. He had found something far more valuable than validation in the green depths of Elderbloom Forest. He had found friends, purpose, and most importantly, he had found himself. The final stretch of the Greenwood run wound through Elderbloom's most ancient quarter, where trees older than kingdoms cast long shadows across paths worn smooth by countless seasons. The small group of survivors moved together now, their earlier competitive spirit transformed into something deeper, a shared determination to see justice done and honor preserved. Broom found himself naturally taking the lead, his intimate knowledge of the forest guiding them along the safest routes. Behind him, Vera's amber eyes scanned the undergrowth for signs of further ambush, while Rock's weathered hands stayed ready at the throwing axes on his belt. Tharn moved with the disciplined alertness of a seasoned warrior, and The handful of other competitors who had joined their impromptu fellowship maintained the watchful silence of those who had learned not to trust the obvious path. As they crested a low hill carpeted with ancient ferns, the sound of celebration drifted to them through the evening air. Drums beat a triumphant rhythm, voices cheered, and the warm glow of torchlight flickered between the trees ahead. The finish line was close now, perhaps no more than a mile through the gathering dusk. But it was another sound that made Brum's steps falter, a harsh voice raised in victory, unmistakably orcish in its guttural triumph. Grashnak Bloodtread had already crossed the finish line, it seemed, and was claiming his prize. "The bastard's done it," Rock muttered, his knuckles white where they gripped his axe handles. "Won through trickery and sabotage." "The race isn't over yet," Vera growled softly. "None of us have finished. There's still time for truth to be revealed." Brum nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at his heart. What proof did they really have? Broken clay spheres that could have come from anywhere, damaged trail markers that might have been vandalized by any number of forest creatures, a fallen tree that could indeed have been brought down by natural causes. Their word against Grashnak's, with nothing but suspicion and circumstantial evidence to support their claims. As if sensing his thoughts, Tharn placed a reassuring hand on the troll's massive shoulder. "Sometimes the truth reveals itself in its own time," the warrior said quietly. "We need only have faith and see this through to the end." The final approach to the finish line led through the glade of memory, a circular clearing where the druids of old had once held their most sacred ceremonies. Ancient standing stones formed a ring around the glade's perimeter, each one carved with symbols that glowed softly in the fading light. At the clearing's heart stood the finish line itself, an archway woven from living branches and adorned with flowers that bloomed in every season. But as Brum and his companions entered the glade, they found a scene that filled them with dismay. Grashnak Bloodtread stood upon a raised platform, a golden laurel wreath upon his brow, and a victor's sash across his broad chest. His supporters cheered and beat their drums, while Eldrin Thalos stood nearby, his ancient face unreadable as he observed the celebration. Other spectators filled the glade, elves from the deep woods, dwarves from the mountain holds, humans from the settled lands, and representatives of dozens of other folk who had come to witness the conclusion of the great race. But their faces showed confusion rather than joy, uncertainty rather than celebration. This victory felt hollow to them, though they could not have said why. Grashnag's cruel eyes found Brum immediately as the troll and his companions emerged from the forest path. "Well, well," the orc called out, his voice carrying easily across the glade. "Look who finally decided to join us. I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost in the woods, troll." The crowd's attention turned to the bedraggled group of runners, and Brum felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in his cheeks. Mud stained his simple clothes. Scratches from thorny branches marked his arms, and his great bulk seemed even more ungainly next to the lean forms of his companions. He looked, he knew, like exactly what Grashnak's mocking tone implied, a bumbling fool who had no business in such company. But then Vera stepped forward, her amber eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "Tell us, Grashnak," she called out, her voice carrying the dangerous edge of a predator's growl. "How did you manage to avoid all the obstacles that plagued the rest of us? The smoke that blinded, the markers that misled, the bridges that had been sabotaged." A murmur ran through the crowd at her words. Grashnak's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his dark eyes, a flash of calculation and wariness. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied smoothly. "I encountered no such difficulties. Perhaps you simply weren't as prepared for the challenges as you thought." Rox stepped forward next, his beard bristling with indignation. "Prepared for drugged vapors that scramble the mind? For trail signs deliberately turned to lead runners astray? What kind of preparation could defend against deliberate sabotage?" "Sabotage?" Grashnak laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Those are serious accusations, dwarf. I hope you have proof to support such claims." It was exactly what Brum had feared. Without concrete evidence, their accusations sounded like nothing more than sour grapes from disappointed competitors. He could see doubt beginning to creep into the faces of some spectators, uncertainty about whether these bedraggled runners were revealing truth or simply making excuses for their poor performance. But then a new voice spoke from the edge of the glade, clear and authoritative, despite its obvious exhaustion. "I can provide proof." All heads turned as Cull Silverleaf stumbled into the clearing, supported by two other elves who had clearly been searching for him in the forest depths. The proud elf, Lord, was a far cry from the elegant figure who had stood at the starting line that morning. His silver hair hung in tangles, his fine clothes were torn and muddied, and one of his legs was bound with makeshift bandages. But his pale green eyes burned with fierce determination. "I witnessed the sabotage with my own eyes," Kyle declared, his musical voice carrying easily across the stunned glade. "I saw Grashnak's supporters placing obstacles on the course, saw them scatter clay spheres filled with noxious substances, watched them turn trail markers to lead runners astray." Grashnak's facade of amused confidence cracked slightly. "And why should we believe you?" he snarled. "An elf who couldn't even finish the race himself." "Because," said a new voice, ancient and weighted with power, "the forest itself has been watching." Eldrin Thalos stepped forward, his staff glowing with increasing brightness. The wizard's pale eyes, which had seemed distant and detached throughout the day, now blazed with inner fire. "Did you think, Grashnak Bloodtread, that your schemes went unnoticed? This is Elder Bloom Forest, where every tree has eyes and every stone has memory. Nothing that transpires here is hidden from those who know how to look." The Archmage raised his staff high, and the carved oak began to pulse with power that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest itself. Images began to form in the air above the glade, translucent scenes that showed the race as it had truly unfolded. The assembled crowd gasped as they witnessed Grashnak's supporters felling the great oak across the path, saw them scatter the disorienting smoke bombs and mind-clouding vapors, watched them turn trail markers and sabotage the ancient bridge. But most damning of all were the images that showed Grashnak himself, moving along secret paths that bypassed every obstacle his minions had created, taking shortcuts known only to those who had scouted the course in advance. "The sacred Greenwood run has been defiled," Eldrin pronounced, his voice heavy with sorrow and anger. The ancient compact of fair competition has been broken by treachery and deceit. Grashnak's supporters had begun to slink away into the shadows at the forest's edge, but the orc himself stood his ground, his face twisted with rage. "Prove I knew what they were doing," he snarled. "You have images of them acting on their own. That proves nothing against me." But Eldrin was not finished. With another gesture of his staff, new images formed. Scenes that showed Grashnak meeting with his supporters before the race, giving them detailed instructions, providing them with maps of the course and precise timing for their sabotage. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. A wave of angry murmurs swept through the crowd. This was more than mere cheating. It was a violation of everything the Greenwood run represented. The ancient race was sacred to all the peoples of the realm, a celebration of fair competition and noble striving. To corrupt it in such a way was an offence that touched every heart present. Grashnak seemed to realize that his position was hopeless. With a snarl of pure fury, he tore the victor's wreath from his head and hurled it to the ground. "Fine," he roared. "So, what if I did? The strong take what they want. That's the law of nature. The weak deserve whatever happens to them." His words hung in the stunned silence that followed like a poison cloud. Even those who might have been sympathetic to a competitor who bent the rules slightly were appalled by such a blatant rejection of honor and fair play. Eldrin Thalos stepped forward, his staff blazing with cold fire. "Grashnak blood tread, you are hereby stripped of all claim to victory in this race. Furthermore, you and all who aided you are banned from Elderbloom Forest for 7 times 7 years. Begone from this place and do not return until you have learned the meaning of honor." The wizard's words carried the weight of ancient magic behind them. Grashnak and his remaining supporters found themselves unable to resist the compulsion that drove them from the glade. The disgraced orc shot one last venomous look at Broom as he was forced to leave, his eyes promising future revenge. But Broom found that the orc's hatred no longer frightened him. He had seen what truly mattered in the depths of Elderbloom Forest, and it had nothing to do with the approval or disapproval of those who chose cruelty over kindness. When the last of Grashnak's party had vanished into the forest, Eldrin turned to address the remaining competitors and spectators. The question now becomes, who is the true winner of this year's Greenwood run? Cale Silverleaf, despite his injuries, stepped forward with the grace that never truly left him. "By rights, it should be whoever crossed the finish line first among those who ran with honor," he said. "I was forced to withdraw after falling into one of their pit traps, so I cannot claim victory." Vera nodded agreement. "I lost hours to their smoke bombs and confusion spells. My time means nothing under the circumstances." One by one, the other competitors acknowledged that the sabotage had affected their performances so severely that any comparison of finishing times would be meaningless. Some had barely managed to complete the course at all, while others had been forced to withdraw entirely. "Then we have a problem," Eldrin mused, stroking his long white beard. "How do we determine a winner when the race itself was compromised?" It was then that Tharn spoke up, his warrior's voice carrying clearly through the glade. "There is one among us whose race was not compromised," he said. "One who encountered every trap every obstacle, every piece of sabotage, and overcame them all through his own virtue and wisdom. All eyes turned to Broom, who stood frozen in surprise at the edge of the clearing. I don't understand, he stammered. Vera's lupine features split in a fierce grin. Don't you see? You were the only one they couldn't touch. Your slowness became your strength. You noticed what the rest of us missed in our haste. Your kindness led you to help others instead of focusing only on your own success. Your humility kept you from taking the obvious paths where their traps were waiting. Rock laughed, the sound booming across the glade. And while the rest of us were being led astray by their schemes, you were following the true path, guided by your knowledge of the forest and your gentle heart. Broom shook his massive head, overwhelmed by the implications. But I came in last. I'm always last. I'm slow and clumsy, and you are exactly what this race needed, Eldrin Thalos interrupted, his ancient voice warm with approval. The Greenwood run is not truly about speed, young troll. It is about character. It is about finding one's true path through the challenges of life. And in that race, that truly matters, you have indeed finished first. The wizard approached the golden laurel wreath that Grashnak had cast aside in his fury. With careful reverence, he lifted it from the ground and carried it toward Broom. Broom Hollowbelly of Elderbloom Forest, by right of fair competition and noble spirit, I name you victor of this year's Greenwood run. As the wreath settled upon Broom's head, something magical happened. The golden leaves began to glow with warm, natural light, not the harsh glare of worked metal, but the soft radiance of living things touched by benevolent magic. The forest itself was acknowledging his victory, blessing his triumph with its ancient approval. The crowd erupted in cheers, not the confused, dutiful applause that had greeted Grashnak's hollow victory, but genuine celebration that seemed to rise from every heart present. Elves and dwarves, humans and halflings, creatures of every kind raised their voices in joyous acknowledgement of a victory that felt right in ways that went beyond mere logic. But for Broom, the most meaningful moment came when his fellow competitors surrounded him, their faces bright with genuine happiness for his success. These beings who had started the day as strangers and rivals had become something far more precious. They had become his friends. You know, Vera said, grinning up at him with her sharp teeth gleaming, I think I understand now why the forest chose you. Speed can be taught, technique can be learned, but wisdom and kindness, those come from the heart. Kyle, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch, but smiling with real warmth, nodded agreement. I have won many races in my long life, the elf lord admitted, but I have never felt as proud of a victory as I do of my defeat today. You showed us what true strength looks like, Broom Hollowbelly. As the celebration continued around him, Broom found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had entered the race hoping merely to finish, to prove to himself that he was capable of completing something meaningful. He had expected mockery, failure, and the familiar sting of being found wanting. Instead, he had discovered reserves of courage and wisdom he never knew he possessed. He had found his voice when it came time to help others, had found his path when others lost their way, and had found his strength in the very gentleness that others had always seen as weakness. But, perhaps, most importantly, he had found acceptance, not just from others, but from himself. The troll, who had started the race ashamed of his size and speed, finished it proud of his heart and character. The victory wreath was beautiful, certainly, but it was only a symbol of the deeper triumph that had taken place within his spirit. As the night deepened and the celebration began to wind down, Eldrin Thalos approached Broom one final time. The ancient wizard's eyes twinkled with something that might have been satisfaction or perhaps secret knowledge. "Tell me, Brum Hollowbelly," the Archmage said quietly, "do you believe in destiny?" Brum considered the question carefully, as he did most things. "I believe we make our own destinies through the choices we make," he replied finally. "But I also believe that sometimes the world conspires to help those who choose wisely." Eldrin smiled, and for a moment his ancient features looked almost youthful. "A wise answer from a worthy champion. The forest whispers to me that this will not be your last great adventure, young troll. There are paths opening before you that you cannot yet imagine." But Brum found that he wasn't concerned about future adventures. He had learned something precious during his journey through Elderbloom Forest. The present moment was enough. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it chose to bring, and he would meet them with the same gentle strength that had carried him through the Greenwood run. As the last of the spectators began to make their way home through the forest paths, Brum lingered in the glade of memory. His new friends had gone their separate ways, promising to visit him in his forest home and to gather again for future races. The victory wreath still glowed softly upon his head, its light blending with the natural phosphorescence of the ancient standing stones. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the glade, an owl called out in the ancient language of the night hunters. A brook babbled its eternal song to the listening stones. The forest breathed around him with the slow, steady rhythm that had comforted him since childhood. Broom Hollowbelly was home, and he was victorious. And for the first time in his very long life, he was completely, utterly happy. The great troll began his walk back to his cave dwelling, moving with the same careful, deliberate steps he had always taken. But now those steps carried him not as one who feared to disturb the world around him, but as one who belonged exactly where he was. His footfalls drummed a gentle rhythm on the forest floor, the victory song of a heart that had finally learned to value itself. Behind him, the standing stones continued their eternal watch over the glade of memory, holding within their ancient hearts the story of the gentlest champion who had ever claimed victory in the sacred Greenwood run. And in the years to come, when other races were run and other champions crowned, the stones would whisper that story to any who had the wisdom to listen. The tale of how kindness conquered cruelty, how patience overcame haste, and how a troll who thought himself slow discovered that he had been moving at exactly the right speed all along.